I love that video, and I love being a part of a church that is so very much alive. I consider it one of the greatest gifts of my life to be able to play the part that God has called me to play in the church here and the work that God is doing in this place. And I'm so glad you guys are here today, whether you've been a part of this church for a few decades or even just a few weeks. Great to have you here. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are watching live online right now. Hey, all of us here at the Dixon City campus, let's put our hands together. Welcome everybody who's watching online. Great to have you guys here as well. This is week number 2 in this teaching series called This Is Us. And we've set aside 4 weeks to talk about who we are as a church, why we do what we do, and why it really does matter. And so we built this entire teaching series around 4 statements, and these 4 statements really help you to understand the DNA of this church, who we are striving to be. And so last week we started with this statement, this is us, we are on a mission. In other words, we believe that if we're going to be the church that God is calling us to be, we have to stay laser focused on the mission that we have been given, that we can't drift from that mission. And we talked last week about the fact that the church was never intended to be just a comfortable place for religious people to hang out together. The church is intended to be a lifeboat in a culture that is sinking. And so if we're going to be a church that is on mission, then we're going to have to be a church that opens its doors and opens its arms to people who are hurting, people with questions, people who are seeking, people who are trying to find a way back to God. If we're going to be a church on mission, then we have to never settle for the slow death of the status quo. We got to be a church that's doing whatever it takes to make a difference here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So we talked about that last week. If you missed that message, you can always go online and catch up. All of the old messages will be there as long as there's electricity, okay? So today I want to talk to you about something that may be missing in your life, an ingredient that may be missing in your life. And this missing ingredient, if it isn't in your life, you'll never be able to live as the follower of Christ that God is calling you to be. And speaking of missing ingredients, there's a story I heard years ago about a pastor who went to visit an older woman from his congregation. So he went to her home to pay a visit, and he sat down, and there on the coffee table was a large bowl of peanuts. And he said, "Do you mind if I have a few of these peanuts while we talk?" And she said, "No, Pastor, that would be fine." And they talked for about an hour, and then he got up to leave, and he looked down and realized that he had eaten this entire bowl of peanuts. And he was very embarrassed. And so he said to her, he said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to eat the entire bowl of peanuts. I only meant to have a few." And she said, "Oh, that's quite all right, Pastor." She said, "Ever since I lost my teeth, all I can do is suck the chocolate off them anyway." Missing ingredient. You'll remember that story, won't you? There may be a missing ingredient in your life, and you may not even realize how much better, how much sweeter your life could be if this ingredient were a part of your life. And the ingredient that I'm talking about is this: authentic, life-giving relationships with other believers. Because here's what we're talking about today. Here's what we believe as a church. We believe that we are better together. The shorthand version of this would be this: we is greater than me. Like when it comes to living out our faith, we are better together. We is greater than me, because faith was never intended to be a me thing. It was always intended to be a we thing. And it's not just what we believe. It's what Jesus taught. It's really what the entire Bible teaches, that following Christ, it can only be done effectively, that living out our faith can only be done effectively when it's done in the context of community where we surround ourselves with other people who are moving in the same direction. So that's what we want to talk about today. Now, as we begin, I just want to draw your attention to a passage of Scripture, 7 verses in a book of the Bible called Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. It's not actually a book as we call it. It was a letter that was written to Christians living in the first century. Specifically, Christians who came from a Jewish or Hebrew background. And I want to begin reading here in verse 19. You can follow along on a Bible app or in your own Bible, or just watch the screen, okay? Verse 19 of chapter 10, it says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way open for us through the curtain, that is his body, And since we have a great high priest, a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God. Not let me, not let you, but let us draw near to God, because faith was never intended to be just a me thing. It's intended to be a we thing. Now, I want to stop right there before I read any further, because those few verses that I just read may be confusing to a number of you, because they include some words and phrases and ideas that sound strange to our ears in our culture today. So let me go back and unpack some of that. I think it'll be worth it. So this book of the Bible, as I mentioned, was written to Jewish people who had become followers of Christ. And it's called Hebrews. Another word for being Jewish was to be a Hebrew. And so whenever you read it, you've got to read it through the eyes of a first century Jewish person and understand their culture and their religious practices. And so everything that I just read, the imagery that was embedded there, was all based on a place of worship that was a part of their lives as they traveled from Egypt through the wilderness to the Promised Land. It was called the Hebrew Tabernacle, okay? Now, the Hebrew Tabernacle was their temporary place of worship as a nation. And I want to give you some of the history behind it, but stick with me because I'm going somewhere with this, okay? So the Hebrew Tabernacle really had three basic areas. There was the courtyard, which was about 80 feet wide, 170 feet long, and surrounded by a fence. And then inside the courtyard was a large tent. It was called the Tent of Meeting. The tent of meeting was divided into two rooms. There was the holy place, and then there was the most holy place. And whenever the tabernacle was set up, it was the Ark of the Covenant that would reside in the most holy place. Okay, that's what Indiana Jones was looking for, in case you're forgetting what the Ark of the Covenant was. It would reside there. That was meant to be representative of God's presence among his people. Now, right in here, there was a curtain that divided the holy place from the most holy place, a very heavy curtain that was woven out of gold and scarlet and blue thread, okay? So this was the layout of the tabernacle. Now, there were very specific laws about where certain people could go or not go. Like in the courtyard, the only people allowed in the courtyard of the tabernacle were Jewish people, Israelites. No foreigners were allowed. And then inside the tent of meeting in the holy place, you could only go in there if you were one of the priests. Like the common average Jewish person would never go in there. And then there was only one person who would go into the most holy place, and that was the high priest. And the high priest would go into the most holy place one time a year on what was called the Day of Atonement, also called Yom Kippur. And so the Day of Atonement was the 10th day of the new year. The people of Israel would spend the first 9 days of the year in reflection and in soul searching. And then the 10th day of the year was the Day of Atonement. And the high priest would go into the most holy place, and he would take with him the blood of an animal. And that animal was meant to be a symbolic sacrifice that was made on behalf of the people of Israel for their sin and their rebellion. And so here's how it's described in the book of Leviticus. He, the high priest, shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people and take its blood behind the curtain, and he shall sprinkle it on the atonement cover, that's the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, and in front of it. In this way, he will make atonement. And so the Day of Atonement, it was a very solemn, very sacred day. The people of Israel would gather around the tabernacle. There would be people praying. There would be people weeping. There would be parents describing all of this to their children. And there was even a sense of awe or a sense of dread, because this was the closest any human being ever got to the actual presence of God. In fact, there was a tradition that developed over time where they would tie a rope to the ankle of the high priest. In case he died inside the most holy place, they could pull him back out because nobody else dared go in there. And all of this was intended to be a picture of the fact that God wanted to dwell with his people, but their sin and their rebellion created a separation between him and his people. And so once a year, one person would come before God with a sacrifice on behalf of the people. And so this ritual was repeated over and over, year after year, year after year. Eventually, the Hebrew tabernacle became the pattern for a permanent building. It was temporary. The permanent building in Jerusalem was the temple. And the same ritual would continue year after year. And all of this foreshadowed the focal point of human history, when one final perfect priest would offer one final perfect sacrifice for all sin, not with the blood of an animal, but with his own blood that was sprinkled on a Roman cross. In fact, the Bible tells us in 2 different places that there was this amazing thing that happened at the very moment when Jesus died on that cross. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, it says this, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." And so, in this very dramatic way, God was saying to the world that an unhindered relationship with him was now possible, that the way is clear, the final sacrifice has been made, the curtain is torn, the door is open. Now, with all of that history, let me read again from Hebrews chapter 10. "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place," not fear, not dread, but confidence to enter the presence of God by the blood, not the blood of an animal, but by the blood of Jesus himself, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body. And since we have a great priest, Jesus, over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. There's so much rich and powerful imagery in all of that, built around this one command: let us draw near to God. Like the God who created the universe invites us into a relationship to draw near to him, which is amazing if you think about it. Because normally, great power means great distance, right? The most powerful people in the world are usually the least accessible people in the world to the common individual. Isn't that true? Like, I'll give you an example. Back in June, there was an auction that was held where you could bid on the chance to have lunch with Warren Buffett in New York City. Now, in case you don't know who Warren Buffett is, he is not Jimmy Buffett's father. Warren Buffett is the 3rd wealthiest man in the world. He's got a net worth of like $82 billion. He is considered to be the best, most astute financial investor in history. And so people want to have lunch with him to figure out some of his investment secrets, like to be able to pick his brain. So, what would you guess someone would be willing to pay to have lunch with Warren Buffett? Turn to somebody next to you. If you're watching online, just talk to yourself. Turn to somebody next to you and guess how high that bid went. You ready? Here's the answer: $4.5 million to have lunch with Warren Buffett. Listen, I'll have lunch with you guys for $100 each. Come on. Here's the point of that. The most powerful people in the world are usually the least accessible people in the world. And yet, the God of the universe, the one with ultimate power, says, I want you to draw near to me. In fact, I have already paid the price. The blood has been shed. The way has been opened. The curtain is torn. Draw near. And listen, if you're a Christian, drawing near to God is not just something you do once. It's something we have to intentionally do every day, because we live in a world that constantly seeks to pull us away from the heart of our Heavenly Father. And drawing near to God is not something we do very well alone. We need to draw near to God together, because faith is not just a me thing, it is a we thing. That's why it says here, let us draw near to God. And that's why it says this, if you keep reading in verse 23, let us, and here's that 2-word phrase again. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. And the hope we profess is everything that I just described to you. Let us hold unswervingly to that hope, for he who promised is faithful. In other words, God is faithful, but will we be faithful to him, or will we swerve? Because the word unswervingly infers that it's possible, there's the potential for any of us to swerve, to drift, to go off course from the hope that we profess. Let me try to illustrate this idea of swerving for you by telling you a little bit about my early history with cars and driving. So, I bought my first car when I was 17, It was a 1966 Buick Wildcat convertible. It's a great car. It had a 401 cubic inch engine and a 4-barrel carburetor. Now, in case you don't know what that means, here's what that means. It means that it got about 3 miles to the gallon, and it was really fast. I loved cruising in my Buick Wildcat convertible. I blew the engine on that after about 6 months. My next car was an AMC Rebel. So my first 2 cars were a Wildcat and a Rebel. So my parents should have had a clue about what that would mean for my driving record, because by the time I was 21 years old, I had had 7 traffic accidents. It is only by the grace of God that I survived adolescence. But one of the accidents that I remember the most, and I was driving my AMC Rebel, I was on my way to work at my summer job, and I'd stopped at the McDonald's drive-thru to get something to eat. And this was in the days before cars had cup holders, so I had my soft drink sitting on the seat next to me. And I hit a bump, and the drink fell on the floor, and I instinctively reached for it because I didn't want it to spill all over the carpet. Now, when I reached down to get my drink, what do you think I did at that moment? I swerved. I drifted. I started going off the road, and there were no rumble strips on the shoulder of the pavement at that time. And so when I looked up, I was headed straight for a concrete bridge abutment. I had just enough time to yank the steering wheel, and instead of hitting it head on, I got the whole right side of my car, the entire right side of my car. From that point on, for the few more months that I had it before I could afford to buy another car, I just referred to it as my abridged AMC Rebel, like I smashed the entire side. Now, what happened to me in the car that day is something that happens to all of us from time to time in life. We begin to drift. We begin to swerve. We live in a world that's full of distractions and temptations and discouragements, and it's really easy to drift off track. And sometimes we don't even realize it's happening because it happens so slowly, almost imperceptibly sometimes. We just get busy with life. We get caught up in the pursuit of material things. We hang out with the wrong people. We have things happen that discourage us, and over time we just start to drift. We just start to swerve a little bit away from the hope that we profess. And here's what's so interesting to me. When we start to swerve, so many times other people notice it before we do. Did you ever recognize that? Somebody else begins to see it before you do. And that's why it's so important to have people in your life that you know, that love you, and people that you trust, so that when you start to drift and when you start to swerve, they can say, hey, watch out. Like, go back to my car accident that day. If I had had somebody else in the passenger seat with me, I'm pretty sure that when I started heading for the concrete bridge abutment, they would have said something loudly and urgently to get me back on track. And that's the thing about having people in your life in the passenger seat with you, on the journey with you. When we're starting to swerve, when we're starting to drift, they can let us know by their life, by their example, by their words. They can help us to understand that we need to get back on track. That's why it goes on to say this in verse 24. And here's that phrase again, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, so that we don't swerve from the hope that we profess. Consider how we can spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And y'all know what a spur is, don't you? Y'all know what that is? Yeah, spurs are something that are used to train horses. And spurs will not injure a horse, but they will create enough discomfort to get that horse to live up to its full potential and become the horse that it can be. And a good trainer knows how to use spurs very effectively. So verse 24 is saying this: let us have people in our lives who can come alongside us like spurs, and by their words and by their example, help us to live up to our full potential. Because here's what I hear Christians say sometimes. I know believers who say this. They say, you know what? I don't really need organized religion. I just kind of do my own thing. Like, I read the Bible, I pray on my own, I walk through the woods, I listen to worship music, I listen to podcasts, but I don't really need organized religion. I sleep in on Sunday mornings, like I go to the Church of the Inner Springs, And that's true. You can, pray on your own, read the Bible on your own, and, listen to worship music on your own, and you should do that. But do you know what you can't do on your own? You can't spur one another on to love and good deeds on your own. The only place that happens is in the context of relationship. I've never known a Christian who was thriving spiritually, who was not also connected in authentic relationship with other Christians who were moving in the same direction. So here's my question. How many people do you have in your life who love you enough and know you deeply enough to come alongside you when they see that you're starting to get discouraged, when you're starting to drift, when you're starting to have questions? They can give you a word of encouragement and spur you on. How many people do you have in your life that you could call at 2 o'clock in the morning with a problem? How many people can just show up at your door without notice any time of the day or night? And listen, if you don't have people like that in your life, building relationships like that will not happen quickly. It takes time and it takes effort. Like there is no drive-through where you can pull up and say, I'll take one friend, supersize him. There's no friend.com website where you can order a good friend and have it delivered next day. You know, it takes time and it takes effort. It takes intentionality. It takes commitment, which is why the passage goes on to say this in verse 25. Again, here's that two-word phrase, not let me, not let you, but let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another. Don't give up on each other. Don't give up on the pursuit of relationship. But let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. And the day there means the day when Christ returns to make all things right. He's saying that as time advances, this just becomes even more important. Now, when I was growing up in church, whenever a pastor would preach on a message on this passage, the application was always this. This is why you need to attend church services. Okay, that was always the point of the message. But as I've thought about this, and as I've come to understand the nature of the early church in the first century, I don't think this is just about showing up for an hour on Sunday and sitting in rows and hearing somebody talk. In fact, the early church did not even own church buildings for the first 300 years of its existence. They would meet in two ways. They would meet in public places and listen to the teaching of the disciples, and then they would meet in homes in smaller groups. This was the pattern of the church at the very beginning. Like go back to Acts chapter 2 when the church explodes into existence in the city of Jerusalem. It says every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts, big public space. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And then Acts chapter 20, this is Paul, the apostle. He's saying goodbye to the Christians in the city of Ephesus. This is kind of a farewell speech. He says, I served the Lord with great humility and with tears. You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you, but have taught you publicly and from house to house. And so in Hebrews chapter 10, when it says, do not give up meeting together, when it says, spur one another on toward love and good deeds, I don't think it's talking about that. I think it's talking about this. Because this is not spurring one another on. This is one spurrer talking to a bunch of spurrees. Okay, that's what that is. This is spurring one another in relationship, in openness, and in honesty. Now, I love what we do at our 3 campuses every weekend. I think what we do when we gather like this on Sundays and on Saturdays, I think it's so important. But this alone will not keep you on track spiritually. Because if the church is nothing more than a crowd of people sitting in the same room listening to the same person talk for an hour a week, that's not what God intended the church to be. God intended the church to be a collection of believers who share a common faith, where there's also the encouragement, mutual encouragement, and the meeting of needs and the sharing of burdens. In fact, if you're somebody who watches online, I would encourage you even not to watch alone. Gather some other people together, get a viewing party going, and talk about this together when it's all done. Begin building those relationships. It's that important, because faith isn't just a me thing. It's a we thing. You know, when our kids were younger, Debbie and I and our family, we really enjoyed going camping. Now, I know for some of you that's not appealing at all. Some of you think, camping, you know, you work all week long and then take a vacation to act like you're homeless. I don't get it. But we really enjoyed camping. And one of my favorite parts of camping was at the end of the day, you just sit around the campfire laughing and talking with friends, and the kids would go off to bed in the camper, and you just sit there and talk and laugh late into the evening. But eventually the campfire would burn down to embers, and the last person to go in to bed for the night would have to make sure that the fire was out. And with these embers, it was really easy to put the fire out, because all you would do is you would take a stick and you would separate the embers. And once they were separated from each other, they would very quickly grow cold. And I've often thought that that's a pretty good picture of what happens when we try to live out our faith in isolation. When we separate ourselves from other believers, it isn't long before our hearts get really cold. And so our goal, if you're a part of this church, if you would describe this as your church, our goal is to help you find authentic relationships with other believers who are on this journey with you, because we need that. Faith is not just a me thing, it is also a we thing. Now, let me give you a very easy way to apply the message today. So, for those of you who are here in the building, on your seat when you came in was a card that looks like this. Go ahead and take it out. Get it in front of you. I just want to walk you through it, okay? On the blue side, there's a place where you can just give us a little bit of contact information. On the other side are all kinds of opportunities for you to get out of a row and into a circle and begin building these relationships. Now, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to think about this and then check a box and turn this in. And all we'll do is send you an email reminder or a text message reminder of the box that you checked, and then you just show up. It's that easy. And I'll try to give you a very thorough explanation of every option so that you can decide which of these might be a good place for you to step into community. Okay, so top left, there's something we offer called Starting Point. And Starting Point is a great option for you if you're new to faith, if you've been away from church for a long time, if you have a lot of questions, a lot of doubts. Starting Point is very convenient. It actually meets during this service time right here in this building, meets on all three of our campuses. And it's 9 weeks long, and we talk about the basics of our faith. And it's an environment where you can just sit in a small group and ask your questions and express your doubts and be able to get all of that out there. And by the way, these options all have a particular Parker Hill campus assigned to them. You're welcome to participate in any one of them, even if you need to drive to a different campus. Even, if you attend the Dixon City campus, you're not limited to the groups that are part of this campus, okay? And we do this by way of trimesters, so the next trimester will start in the next couple of weeks, and it will run till about Thanksgiving, okay? So Starting Point, you keep going down the list. There are groups specifically for men and women. There's a men's group that'll run for 7 weeks, women's group that'll run for 8 weeks. Great opportunity to build relationships with other men, guys, or other women, ladies. At the bottom of the left-hand side, there's a group that's going to be starting in a couple of weeks. It's called Christian. It's Not What You Think. And so here's the kind of in a nutshell, what this group is all about. We've recognized and we believe that over time, there's a lot of stuff that gets piled on top of the word Christian. Church traditions, political views, all kinds of perceptions. And so during this group, we just want to go back to the very beginning and try to discover, what was it really supposed to mean to be a follower of Jesus, a Christian? What did that mean back then? What should it mean today? Now, this may be very helpful for you if you come from a different church background. Like if you're coming to Parker Hill from a Roman Catholic church or a mainline Protestant church, and things are a little bit different here, and you're trying to figure out, okay, when I grew up, we did this. Where's that fit in? What does the Bible say about that? What really does it boil down to when you think about Christianity? So that group is very convenient, meets right here at the campus. There's one at every single one of our campuses, and it's a Tuesday night group. Jump into that if that's a good option for you. On the right-hand side, there are some groups that are for particular seasons of life. For those of you who are single and in your 20s, there's a group in the Clark Summit area. For those of you who are single and 30 or over, huge group of singles, great group that meets here in Dixon City. And there's also a group called Prime Time for those of you who are retired or semi-retired, meets during the daytime on Tuesdays beginning September 24th. And then at the bottom, there's a group called Financial Peace University. And this is a great group because we recognize that one of the biggest stresses in people's lives and in marriages today is managing finances. And it's one of the leading causes of divorce. And so we offer this course called Financial Peace University. It features the teaching of Dave Ramsey, who is just fun to listen to. And everybody who takes this class talks about what a turning point it was in their personal lives and how they found peace financially. I wish everybody at Parker Hill would take the class at least once. And then at the very bottom there is what we call community groups. And community groups are just that. They meet somewhere in the community. There are groups in all kinds of communities throughout northeastern Pennsylvania. And if you check that box, we'll just give you a call, ask you where you live and what kind of group you want to be a part of, and we will get you plugged in to one of those, okay? So take advantage. There are a lot of opportunities. Don't be anonymous. Don't just come in, sit for an hour, and leave. Begin to build those relationships. There will come a point in your life where you will need them. Now, we talk about this all the time, and whenever we talk about it, there are certain objections that people have. Let me tell you the 4 most common objections I hear when it comes to moving beyond a row and getting into a circle. Number 1 is this: I don't want to get stuck in a group of people where I don't fit. Okay, I get that. Been there. No fun. But here's the thing. You're not stuck in a group. They last for about 7 or 10 weeks, and even if you get a couple of weeks into it and you're like, okay, these are not my people, you just graciously exit and you try another one next time. It's okay. You're not stuck. Number 2, most common objection: I tried a group once. It didn't go well for me. That happens. Not every group is a great fit for every person. But let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if you've ever had a bad meal at a restaurant. How many have ever had a bad meal? All right. How many of you have stopped eating because you had a bad meal? No, you haven't. I can tell. Just because you have a bad experience in a group, you don't want to give up the pursuit of relationship. It is that important. You just pull up your big boy pants and you try again. You just try another group, okay? Number 3, third objection: I've already got friends. I'm happy for you. That's good. Here's my question. At what point in your week, at what point in the month, do you and your friends sit down, open the Bible, learn together, pray together, and ask what God is doing in your lives? Because we're not just talking about having friends, we're talking about structuring something that has a spiritual flavor to it so that you can encourage each other and spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And the second thing I would say to this objection is this: maybe it's not just always about us and what we need and what we have. What if there's somebody in a group that you might join who just needs you to be there? What if there's somebody who will look back someday on their own spiritual journey and say, man, I'm so glad I joined that group because for 10 weeks I got to meet Joe, or I got to meet Betsy, or I got to meet Harry, and man, my experience with them and what they told me and what they poured into my life, that was life-changing. Maybe it's not just about us. Fourth, most common objection is this one: I'm too busy. And the truth is, we're all busy. You ask somebody how they're doing. If they're an American, they'll say, I'm doing good. But man, I'm busy. You know, because our lives are filled with opportunities and options, and we can fill our time with all kinds of stuff. Here's the question: is the stuff that we're busy with really that important? Does it really matter? Because sometimes I think if we could step back and objectively look at our lives, we'd realize that a lot of the stuff we give our time to isn't that important. Let me tell you what's important. What'll matter? Relationships. At the end of this whole thing called life, what you're going to look back on that's really going to matter is the people that you loved and served and connected with and poured into, and the people who sharpened you. So we want to see you get connected in authentic, life-giving relationships. So look that card over, find a good option. You can turn it in on your way out today. We'll take it from there. Before you go, though, I want you to hear a story. And this is a story from Tom and Paula Campbell. They attend our Clark Summit campus. They've been a part of several different groups. They came to a point this summer where they realized how important it is to have people around you at certain times in life. Watch this with me.
You just experience all kinds of emotions when you're standing there watching your home burn, and there's nothing you can do about it. Throughout those hours that we stood there and the firemen worked on the house, we had people come up to us, not just from the community, but mostly from our previous small groups. We have invested in each other over the years, and we've been with each other and their family. Our small group people are family. When you attend a large church, you really need the community of a small group.
Other than going to church Sunday morning, it's probably the only thing I really do that gets me in a consistent relationship with other people. I love listening to Mark preach, but if that's all it was, it'd be a little weak. You know, having those relationships where you're with people and you're sharing and helping each other grow, that's awful important.
Relationships are grown when you do life together. You're building the relationship to the point where you can share things that you wouldn't share with an acquaintance, but with somebody who maybe has walked the same path that you have. They understand and they know how to pray for you. That enables you to share life on a deeper level.
It's almost like a living organism where some people have skills and assets that can help other people when they're down. And it doesn't have to be the flashy ones. I really get a lot of personal satisfaction out of helping people clarify what they need and how they can get there. So that gives me a sense of who I am. I'm relatively quiet on the other times. You know, I sit back more than anything else, but I think maybe not.
We had a fire on July 1st. It destroyed Tom's studio, and a lot of the house bore the brunt of not only fire, but also damage from smoke and water. We were just shown a lot of love and support, especially by our small group. And they were there at the fire with us. And then were there in the days afterwards. Brenda was one of the women in the kitchen packing things, and Kathy was right there. We just saw such an outpouring, and they didn't just come once. They called and said, "What's the plan for today? Do you need me?" It's a very humbling experience.
Yeah.
To be on that side of a tragedy.
And you don't do a small group because you think, gee, someday I might need it. We do small groups because we like people, we like friends, we like to have relationships. I like to know when somebody has a new job or has more stress in their life, or when they need a little bit of help and I can do something other than just work.
You gain so much from a small group, relationship-wise, spiritually, just having fun with other Christians. It's worth the time and the energy.
Yes, it's a relationship.
Right.
It's kind of what it's all about.